Good morning. Thank you for joining me this morning. I know that there's a lot of competition for media attention with the transfer of authorities for the Chief of Defense Staff position, but I wanted to have a chance to brief the press gallery and the Canadian public about why I'm taking a second run at asking the Speaker of the House for an emergency debate on the question of the Canada-China Investment Treaty, the document I hold here. I first saw the text of this agreement on September 26th when it was tabled in the House. Within 24 hours, I'd prepared a letter for the Speaker asking for an emergency debate, and I made that request on October 1st. Just to give some parliamentary procedural background for people, the Speaker of the House is under no obligation, and in fact is discouraged through parliamentary tradition from giving reasons for when a request for an emergency debate is either granted or denied. So there's not, and they want to avoid building up a sense of jurisprudence over what should guide the Speaker's decision. So there have been a lot of different kinds of issues that have gone to emergency debate over the years, and it's hard to necessarily see a common thread, but there are certain rules. Standing Order 52, which is found in the Standing Rules of Parliament, sets out the basic rules, which is it has to be something within the administrative power of the federal parliament. It has to be something that is of national importance. It should be something of acute, obvious or acute national importance, and it also should be urgent. Obviously, it's an emergency debate. In the last number of months under this Speaker, we've had an emergency debate on drug shortages. We had an emergency debate on the E. coli crisis and XL beef. But only going back a couple years to 2009, the House held an emergency debate on the Ottawa transit strike. In 2003, there was an emergency debate on the approaching war in Iraq, in which Canada was not a participant. And going back to 1989, there was an emergency debate on Tiananmen Square. So there's a wide range of topics that have come before emergency debate in the House. People might wonder, well, since I was turned down on October 1st, what makes me think it's worth trying again October 29th? And the reason is this. October 1st, and I have to do this by inference, one of the rules the Speaker has to consider is, quote, the Speaker shall also have regard to the probability of the matter being brought before the House within reasonable time by other means. Now, on October 1st, there were 4 opposition days that were possible for debating this topic. 1 belonged to the Liberals, 3 belonged to the NDP. As it happened, and I'm not criticizing their decisions, those are decisions made by other parties, and I think primarily the responsibility for getting this treaty debated rests solely and primarily on the Minister of Trade, Ed Fast, and on the Prime Minister. So I don't begrudge the fact that other parties made a decision, frankly, I wouldn't have taken in their shoes, but that's another matter. None of the opposition day debates were chosen for the question of the Canada-China Investment Treaty. But the Speaker couldn't have known that on October 1st when he said I couldn't get the emergency debate. There's also the possibility that the House of Commons Committee on Trade might have taken it up. There were certainly efforts both by the member for Malpeque, Wayne Easter, and member for Vancouver Kingsway, Don Davies, who were members of the Trade Committee, to get the Trade Committee to have proper hearings on this topic. They were unsuccessful because of the majority of Conservatives on the Trade Committee. So my argument there is that the Speaker could have, in fact, assumed, or at least held it as a possibility, that defeated the notion of probability that this would be dealt with by another means. He could have been considering that when he refused my motion for an emergency debate October 1st. I've also provided the Speaker with some constitutional law background, and that goes to the question of treaty making in Canada. This has gotten a lot of discussion in media, but I don't think it's gotten a lot of substantive analysis. It is true that treaty making falls under something called the royal prerogative historically, that it's between one country and another country, and that only some treaties must go before Parliament. So what kind of treaties must go before Parliament? Treaties that involve implementing legislation. So if you can't execute a treaty without having to pass domestic laws that are changed, such as tariffs change, and import-export rules change. If those have to change, well, clearly Parliament has to do it. This kind of treaty, a set of promises one way to the other to go to something that does not affect our courts, does not affect our domestic law. We're going to go to arbitration hearings in a hotel room somewhere with 3 international arbitrators who are going to decide if Canada owes China money. That doesn't require any implementing legislation. And that's why this is a class of treaty that does not have to go to Parliament. But does that mean it shouldn't go to Parliament? And this is where I quote for the Speaker something from, believe it or not, my 1977 textbook from law school. But anyway, never mind. The law hasn't changed on this. I checked it. This is still, Peter Hogg is still the acknowledged expert in constitutional law in Canada. And what he pointed out is, quote, despite the absence of any constitutional obligation to obtain parliamentary approval for this kind of treaty, it has been the practice of Canadian governments to obtain parliamentary approval of the most important treaties in the interval between signing and ratification. So step back. In this case, signing was September 9th, tabling was September 26th, ratification could be as soon as this Friday. Now, I continue with the quote. I didn't put this part in my letter to Speaker Scheer. The government will lay the treaty before Parliament and move a resolution in each House approving the treaty. The resolution is not in statutory form and does not receive royal assent. Of all the treaties which Canada ratified between 1946 and 1966, approximately 1/4 were submitted to Parliament for approval. Now, and then they say, however, there is no practice of securing Parliament's approval of treaties which do not require ratification, and those are now a more common kind of treaty. Well, this is a treaty that requires ratification, and Parliament is giving no option for approval. What's very, I hate to use the word duplicitous, but it's the only one that comes to mind, of Prime Minister Harper and his cabinet, is the repeated assertion that their process is fairer than what previous governments did, because in 2008 they adopted the practice of tabling treaties as a required policy matter. Treaties must be tabled before the House, where there must be a requisite 21 sitting days of Parliament before ratification, but with no provision whatsoever for debate and vote. I asked the Speaker in my letter if this new provision of tabling the treaty for 21 days, far from being what the Conservatives claim as an improvement and increased transparency, is in fact, in my view, the question is, does this become a ritualistic denial of democracy? So we are now 4 days from the end point, where Canada will become committed to a treaty for a minimum of 31 years. I mean, you could read it as potentially 15 years only, but I think Professor Gus Van Harten is right. Really, it's a minimum of 31 years that we are bound by terms that have never been debated in the House of Commons, that have never been seen by the Canadian public, that will bind us in ways that could cost us billions and deny us our own laws and our own ability to chart our own course, our ability to bring back a proper Fisheries Act, our ability to repair the Environmental Assessment Act. Even our ability to set forward a net benefits test that works under the Internet and the Investment Canada Act could be scuppered by a treaty that's going to come into force after 21 sitting days of look but don't touch, don't speak. It's not your business as parliamentarians to care what your Privy Council is about to commit you to. I really am hopeful that the Speaker of the House will realize that with 4 days remaining until the Prime Minister can ratify this treaty with no debate and no vote, that now is the time, if ever there was an issue that met all the tests for an emergency debate under Standing Rule 52. I think this is it, and I'm hoping the Speaker will agree with me. I'm certainly open to answer any questions you have.